tifa tifa te po, tifa tifa te ao. Nā rangi tū koe, nā rangi roa, nā tāne rawa koe. Nā te apārangi I ihi ihi, nā te apārangi I rarapa. Tuku ai wharerangi, tenga huru mairangi, ti hei mauri ora whakamaua kia tina, tina, haumi e tāiki. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora everyone, haere mai ki te hui nei and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Christina Howard and I'm delighted to be hosting this webinar today on behalf of Inspiring Communities. And first of all, thank you so much, Victor, for opening our webinar today with the karakia. So thanks so much everyone for joining us to celebrate the power of place-based collaboration. In this webinar, we are taking the opportunity to dig into the drivers of success and the wider trends happening in place-based change here in Aotearoa and around the globe. And there is growing recognition and certainly respect for local communities that we are seeing for local communities, hapū and iwi, who have shown how effectively they partner with all parts of the system when the opportunity is provided to be part of the response to the ongoing challenges that we all face. And today our panelists are going to discuss just some of the elements that need to shift so that these ways of working become more enabled and more prevalent. We'll look at what we can learn from the experiences of those working at the coalface of hapū and iwi development and community-led development here in Aotearoa, as well as trends in Australia and around the world. And many of these themes echo the highly relevant lessons learned over the COVID pandemic and lockdown response that we articulated in the Shaping the Future report, which we produced after the first national lockdown. And we'll explore how to shift from the rhetoric of engaging with communities and Māori to actually applying an Indigenous lens and a community-led focus. And the great news is that there is a lot of positive change happening out there. And where success is occurring, it's really evident that focusing on the process itself is vital to achieving good outcomes. But before we get underway, let's briefly meet our panelists. So firstly, you've already heard from Victor, and I'm really thrilled to introduce him. Victor Walker, he hails from Uawa on the East Cape, and his whakapapa is to Te Aitanga-a-Hauiti. So Victor is the author of He Manawa Māori, which is a report he's just finished for Inspiring Communities that explored the amazing mahi occurring in whānau hapū and iwi and Māori community development over the last 40 years, really, right up until today. We also have with us Anna Powell, who is very generously giving us her time from Australia. She is coming to us from just south of Hobart in Tasmania, where she is on Muwanina land. Anna is the CEO of Collaboration for Impact, which is a non-profit organisation which supports people to work together to achieve systems change and an equitable and inclusive society. So she's got some fascinating insights to share from what's happening with that over the ditch with us today. Last but not least, we have our very own vastly experienced and skilled Inspiring Communities colleague, Courtney, coming to us today from Whakatū, Nelson, and she'll be drawing on local and international insights on the key ingredients that enable place-based collaboration. So it's great to meet you all. So let's get started. And as our speakers are talking, don't forget to post your questions in the Q&A. We'll get to them once we've taken time to hear from all of our panelists. So we're going to start with Victor. And Victor, you write in your introduction to the He Manawa Māori report about just finding yourself a really privileged witness to the amazing efforts of so many people for so long to lead and support change. So maybe we can start with the title, He Manawa Māori, and what brought you to that. And then it will be difficult, I know, but perhaps just sharing 2 or 3 insights from the report with us.
Kia ora, Christina. Thank you for that introduction.
We might need you to unmute, Victor.
Yes. Unmuted now. Is that okay? Kia ora, Christina.
Great, I can hear you now. Thank you.
And thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. O tira tēnā tātou. Tēnā tātou te hunga e whakarongorongo mai ana. Ko tōku pepeha, ko titirangi te maunga, ko ua nui a rua matua te awa, ko te rāwhioro te whare wānanga, ko hene matioro taku piki kōtuku, ko te kania takirau, te upoko ariki, ko parikura horomia, te kai ngākau, a tēnei rā a te Aitanga-a-Hauiti e mihi nei ki a tātou katoa i tēnei rā, kia ora tātou. Yes, Christina, and welcome to all the viewers and listeners. Just made me feel like a radio host there. I had the amazing privilege to interview 20 Kōrero related to the Inspiring Community Māori Network recently. The inquiry was to discuss and explore what a treaty honouring Aotearoa would look like. The report, as you mentioned, He Manawa Māori, a Māori heart, I hope, captures and articulates in the most honourable way their views and aspirations, for which I remain truly grateful. I would like to share 2 things that became self-evident during the interview process. The first is legacy and the privilege of heritage, inspired by the pepeha or tribal expression of all the Kōrero, a heritage that connected them clearly, proudly, and uncompromisingly with their past, and that now not only shapes their present, but determines their future in the citizenship of Aotearoa New Zealand. Every interview began with their pepeha and mihi, and I reciprocated. And then began the deep dive, inexorably pulling me, drawing me into the depths of their heart, their heartiness, their aspirations for their whānau, for their hapū, marae and iwi, always underpinned by mana whakapapa, spiritual and genealogical connections, mana tangata, unrelenting and enduring positive outcomes in culture, education, health and wellness, politics, business, and last but not leastly, mana whenua and mana moana, which simply means the kaitiakitanga of guardianship and custodianship of all environments. The passion, Christina, and commitment to realise their potential, the potential of their pepeha at a multiplicity of levels, was just truly awe-inspiring. Actually, this was Tino rangatiratanga and mana motuhake, self-determination and pedagogy in practice. This was the manawa Māori. This was the manawa Māori. This was the Māori heart. Unfortunately, the quest for self-determination and the pathway to a true sharing of the power and resource in this country remains inequitable. And this has huge implications for the Māori heart beating strongly at maximum capacity and at maximum capability. While all the Kōrero we're acutely aware of the numbers that see Māori disproportionately represented in almost every negative statistic in society. They were not preoccupied by it. This didn't preoccupy them in terms of the information that they were sharing with me. Quite the contrary, actually. They are already aware and employing strategies to improve the way current Crown agency systems or structures respond in a treaty honouring way to support the mana or influence of their pepeha. Many hapū are already doing this. Many hapū and iwi are already doing this and doing it in their own way, with or without you. They will choose the river of least resistance, the pathway of least resistance, and just get on with doing it. They're not going to wait for any of us. But all the Kōrero agree, every Kōrero, they all agree that it could be better, much better. Which brings me to the second truth, which was that there is genuine value in celebrating the ideal or the notion, the innovation really, of dual heritage and shared futures. In understanding and appreciating that we all have a wonderful heritage. Okay, there's some rusty bits. There's some rusty bits that we're all tinkering with right now, and have been doing so for a long time. But they're ours nonetheless, and they are, as Parikura Horomia would say, we've all got a little bit of rust and we've all got a little bit of royalty. It's just a matter of enjoying and celebrating all aspects. But Māori understand their heritage. Don't get me wrong in terms of what the feedback presented. Māori understand their heritage and the challenges for the treaty partner. The challenges for the treaty partner for all to understand and appreciate it as well. And in doing so, appreciate their own, because we've all got a wonderful history to share. But to get to the crux of the matter, they are over-educating, they're over-cajoling and wasting precious time in enhancing everything about their pepeha. In this way, tangata tiriti is seen as a valuable ally for he manawa Māori to enhance and consolidate their tino rangatiratanga, the tino rangatiratanga of the manawa, the autonomy and self-governance for Māori, for their place and their people. And so just to finish off, this tangata tiriti can, in the view of the Kōrero, and I really like this quote, was that tangata tiriti can carry the torch of entitlement, the torch of enlightenment to all those resources shown and unknown, to educate, illuminate, and let it be known that Māori are demanding a change, that Māori are demanding a change in the tikanga or behaviour as to how you relate to and interact with their treaty partner, with the treaty partner. Understand the manawa Māori and understand the manawa of Aotearoa New Zealand. And in this way, we will enjoy a shared future together. So that was essentially the report. Very, very briefly, Christina, and I hope I've given it the due consideration and deference that I was privileged to be a part of.
Ngā mihi. Victor, thank you so much for sharing those actually very positive and heartfelt insights. I think you've done a great job of conveying the spirit of what you were entrusted with, and of course we will be sending a link out for everyone. We already have, and it's on the Inspiring Communities website if you want to read that in person. So And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the practical things that we can be doing to carry that torch of enlightenment better. So later on in the webinar. So Anna, let's now turn to Australia, where I understand there is a growing government commitment to collaborative place-based development. So we'd really love for you to elaborate on what you're seeing where you are.
Thanks, Christina, and wonderful to be here. I just want to, I guess, ground it in what Victor's shared with us around what it means to have true power sharing, and the work of all of us to do that. So yeah, there's over the last 10 years, we've seen huge shifts here in Australia, and really important that we recognise that builds on generations, many generations of communities organising and leading change in ways that are relevant for their context and right for their cultures. So over the last 10 years, the shifts have been more resourcing, I think a deeper understanding of the shared practice that it takes from all parts of the system. So I guess I want to just focus on three key things that we're seeing that really build off the relationships and work we've been seeing at community level, at the state, regional level, and nationally as well, across this very diverse country. And this is really in the context here in Australia of a growing call for huge dialogue around what it means to have voice, truth, and treaty in Australia. And as you mentioned, Christina, a growing, in pockets, but growing commitment from government to working in place. So we're seeing some really great promise in terms of how government's seeing the work and resourcing it. So three things there. So one, and this all goes to the heart of what it really means, I think, to share power in ways that privilege and centre communities leading change. So one is flow of funding. You know, this goes to the heart of it, the sharing, the power, the sharing of resources. And what we're seeing here is, yes, continued funding to programs and services, that's important. But we are also seeing some state governments, Commonwealth governments, experimenting and learning into what it means to really fund that connective tissue for collaboration to happen in place. So that goes beyond the services and programs that are also important. And what we're seeing is through these initiatives for place-based funding, that it means the backbone organisations or the work of actually holding collaborations in place have enough resources to get off the ground and do the work that really matters of weaving, building relationships in place. And off the back of that, when they're really funded over the long term and authorised, they can then take that out beyond the prism of place to look at that as really system stewards across different levels. So we're seeing communities, a great initiative up here in Northwest Tasmania, that's also then weaving relationships between state government, federal government, big not-for-profits that are working in place and really aligning efforts. A recent announcement and data sharing that means that that community now has access to their data from the state government. So some really great, shifts starting to happen there around what happens when governments really come in to back communities and fund the work that we know is important of collaboration. At the same time, we are also doing some work experimentation around what it means for governments to align that place-based funding so that it's not yet more cascading of different funding and different frameworks for place-based change. So that's where we're at now here in Australia. The second one is the learning and evaluation. So really, again, to get to the heart of what it means to be sharing power with community, goes to seeing that we are all part of the system. So, you know, government as not just community needing to build capacity or learning, we're starting to see governments seeing themselves as part of the change, their own capacity building, their own evaluation of themselves, and seeing the mutual accountability coming through there. So this goes to principles that, you know, that we are all accountable to each other as stewards of the systems we're leading, recognising the interdependence that we all have. And so really practically, there's some great examples there with, again, state and Commonwealth governments starting to evaluate not just the outcomes, but the process of change. Co-creating and deciding on what are those key principles that both communities, governments and other stakeholders value as part of the change process. You know, so there's some excellent prototypes, tools that are being used around progress mapping, where all key parts of the system actually come together once a year, reflect on those principles. Where are we making progress? Where are we not? And for what reasons? Really valuing and deciding together what those principles are for measurement, and committing to ongoing learning relationship to those. And the third one to bring in is really what we've been talking about, is the connections and networks. Again, at the heart of power sharing is who has proximity and relationship and to whom. So what we are seeing, and I mean, this goes to what Megan and I have been talking about in networks we've got with Tamarack Institute and others internationally, the work it takes at a local level with backbones and other ways of holding the work locally, as well as in those spaces between the local to national and internationally. The work of field builders like Inspiring Communities that really hold broker that middle space between the different parts of the system, support the work across and between communities, you know, supporting the work into government and other funders and decision makers. So we're seeing that, yes, great change can be happening in sharing power and the work of collaborative change in place, but also how do we amplify that and continue to build the field, which really requires investment in the work of field builders and other types of intermediaries that can, you know, work on those spaces between the initiatives. So they three key things that we're seeing great promise here in Australia. Perhaps come back to some of the examples of how that's showing up.
Yeah, Mihi, and those are some really thought-provoking insights and interesting examples. So hopefully we will get an opportunity to unpack those a little bit more later. Don't forget, if you're listening in and you have any questions or want to know more, pop something in the Q&A so we can hear from our panelists on those things. And yes, let's move on to Megan. As Anna just referred to, you are extremely well networked with place-based innovators around the world, and of course doing lots of mahi on the ground here in Aotearoa as well. So really keen to hear what key insights you have that you've been gleaning both from that work and from what you're hearing.
Kia ora, and thanks, Christina. I guess in some of the things I'm going to say next, which is a bit of a rapid fire, also build on what Anna and Victor have also shared. So rather than see it as duplication, I want to see it as kind of reinforcement of some of the key themes. So if we think about international trends that we're seeing, firstly, the growing importance of relationships. You know, there's been a lot of effort on big data and integrated systems and structures and things like that, but actually with quality relationships and deeper dive relationships, recognition that we're not going to address things like power, trauma, and kind of authentic engagement. So interestingly, the Stanford Social Innovation Review, looking at 10 years of collective impact, the bigger work they see that needs to happen moving forward in that deeper relationship space. So yeah, important to take note of. The next thing is just to reflect on, you know, post-COVID, you know, everyone's saying across the world there is more collaboration happening, and it is more creative and there is more connectivity, all really, really important stuff. And again, the notion of collaboration, it's a new way of working, people needing new skill sets to do this mahi. So we need to be constantly building our skills to be able to do the work and live the promise of working together. The third bit to touch on is the kind of notion of networks and connections. Lots more collaboration happening, but sometimes it's staying in kind of sector silos. So how do we get those things moving across? So importantly, thinking about networks at a neighbourhood level, you know, Facebook groups, etc., where relationships really happen, right through to kind of connections between central government kind of sector related stuff. So yeah, opportunities for more alignment, but also that need for kind of brokers and weavers that Anna was talking about before. I was reflecting one of the pieces of work we did 20 years ago in the wonderful West Waitakere was that, you know, the notion of strategic brokers, and no one really understood what that meant, but it seems like 20 years on, actually, this is really important concepts and language and roles to be talking about. And it's not just talking to people, it's a lot more than that that's involved. So I think we need to do more in that kind of broker space. The next thing to think about is what we're seeing is a focus on equity, because that's on everyone's minds and lips and eyes as well. It's been elevated through COVID, as we know. The other thing that's occurring to me is we're seeing that word stewardship that's been used in a couple of different contexts. I think internationally, everyone's grappling with what collaborative governance actually looks like. What we've been doing is using old traditional governance tools that are very top down for this new collaborative context, and it doesn't really work. But actually evolving into what these new tools may be is still work in progress that everyone's kind of saying we need to do more work on. And yeah, what the other thing we're seeing internationally as well is a greater acknowledgement of the healing and the reconciliation work that needs to happen, and the value and the wisdom of Indigenous communities as that kind of torch of enlightenment that we all need to have, that Victor referred to, and that notion of dual heritage, shared futures. And just thinking one of the concepts that kind of struck me early in the year was that notion of two-eyed seeing that kind of comes from the Arcadia community in Eastern Canada. That notion that actually when we see with our Western eyes and our Indigenous eyes and bring the best of those together for the benefit of all, the next kind of stage of change can be enabled. I just want to touch briefly on some of the lessons from international work, and I'm going to throw up a slide now that actually don't have to bother about reading it all, because I think in a summary it kind of reflects the principles of community-led development that we've been using, and this comes out of the UK, and also some of the shifts from shaping our future that Christina mentioned. There's a couple of things that I wanted to touch on, and one is number 3 and 4 there. Get on with doing things, not planning them. I think there's been a bit of a frustration here, and obviously they're seeing it in the UK about big strategy stuff, and actually that takes a lot of resource and effort. What about implementation? How can we get to doing stuff together earlier? It also echoes comments that I remember Jim Deers has made on his several visits to New Zealand. Our neighbourhood power friend from Seattle, is kind of saying New Zealanders they want to plan things, you know, just get on and do it. So something for us to think about that they're noticing in the UK. Also, number 4 there, that notion of real-time learning. A few years ago, and I think back in 2013, we produced one of our first books called Learning by Doing. Actually, we've noticed heaps of people using that term, learning by doing, in the last few years, and it's really important. That's not to diminish the value of kind of bigger evaluation processes, but actually that notion of working together, that progress mapping that Anna referred to, being really important as well. Learning matters, and we're hearing that word a lot more. A couple of comments about what we're seeing here in Aotearoa as well. I think place is growing a little bit in terms of its focus in New Zealand, but it's been a region. You know, the definition or the unit of place has really been region. It's efficient for government, not so much for community though, because when you aggregate up, you lose the specific vision and needs and issues and aspirations of local places. So some work there, I think, for us to think about. As Victor mentioned, you know, and echoed by the Kai Kōrero that he spoke with, we're seeing and hearing and feeling, you know, whānau hapū and iwi Māori leadership across the country, the mana motohake, which has been enabled by treaty settlements and different funding arrangements. We're seeing Māori more and more being able to do things in their own ways, in their own places, for their own people, with benefits for everyone, which is just awesome to see. And that's also reflecting through into the regional tables, if we think that is the kind of organising unit that's useful for the Crown at the moment. Having iwi as a partner at those tables is really awesome. And it has struck me in terms of thinking about at what point and when is it right for community to also be part of those tables. At the moment, community is kind of seen as a stakeholder, not a partner. And I know, there's lots of issues to kind of unpack in there, but it's, you know, what's the work that we need to do so that community can also be ready to be part of that that way of thinking and planning for our places. I think, though, just one little comment, we've got some work to do in terms of strategic community organising, because it's quite patchy around the country from what we've seen in terms of community infrastructure being strong enough to have advocacy and voice. So some work to do there. For our last comments, yeah, we're seeing, I think all of us have been on a learning journey with Te Tiriti, inspiring communities included. What's the relational and the decolonising work that we all need to do to be better treaty partners? And I think we're seeing lots of commitments to that weren't there a few years ago, people doing more and more work. And we're seeing lots more kind of focus on joined up services and planning. I'm hearing the words collective impact used an awful lot more than they were. And I think more words around co-design and better engagement has been a much stronger focus in the last couple of years as well, which is really awesome. I guess for me, the next step is thinking about how we move that not just from co-design into actually co-production and doing stuff together, the learning by doing together. That's the next phase. So yeah, more community-led language. And it's all in the how. It's not the what we do, it's how we do it as ever. So yeah, optimistic about things to come and how we can leverage the good stuff that is happening in Aotearoa and across the world at the moment.
Kia ora, thanks, Megan. Those are some fascinating insights in seeing the linkages between what's happening internationally, what's happening here, and where we could perhaps be going and developing more strongly. So I'm sure that there are things that our audience is going to want to dig into a wee bit deeper. Please do drop those questions into the Q&A. We are going to get to them very shortly. And in the meantime, I think it would be great just to have some deeper reflection and conversation amongst all of our panelists. So we're just going to pop up a slide now, which is a diagram that I think has been developed within Inspiring Communities. And it speaks to the theme of honouring and supporting the aspirations of people in a place and the weaving, the connections and the relationships that are needed to successfully do that have been shared by all of our speakers. And what we've also heard is that, particularly from you, Victor, that the people who've been working in place for their own communities, for their own hapū and whānau, you know, they're getting a bit tired and they're looking for people who will actually enable this work rather than override it or block it. So I'm interested, you know, if government agencies want to enable and share in the success of place-based development, how they can develop better relationships and more effectively working alongside the local leaders and the others who've been doing this hard mahi for so long. So what are some of the key changes in the ways of working that would help, things that people could do or maybe stop doing? Victor, to kick us off, do you have any examples or thoughts to share?
Good, Christina. So in regard to the example of understanding our pepeha, which is our tribal, our community expression, which is so important to us, it's in the experience with our Kōrero, it was beholden on funders, on Crown agencies to understand that all our pepeha are different. So in that respect, in order to understand our iwi, our hapū, our marae, we need to understand their place and their story. And when we do that, we become more aware and understand of what their voice is. It should never be our voice. And I guess what's happening at the moment that we've got, and quite frankly, Māori have expressed the fact that they are over the consultation around different programs, projects, when the consultation is happening at them, not with them. And in actual fact, it should start at the place base, at the community, at the pepeha of the group who are looking to resource their innovation, to enhance again their pepeha. And just to add ever so briefly, what seems to be happening is that we have a consultation round which happens in a community, even regionally. But by the time that is translated back to central government, back to national office, it changes totally. So that, and actually it's totally doesn't represent the ideal that everyone, all the hands that were on the table initially, the voices that were shared, and the mutual understanding of the value that everybody had in terms of achieving that the objective of that particular innovation or project. So that needs to happen more.
Great. Thanks, Victor. I think those are some really great insights. You know, one of them around doing your homework, actually understanding the pepeha and the history of where you're going into to start off with, and then, yeah, that making sure things aren't lost in translation. So maybe some different processes are required to ensure that the heart of the feedback and the input and the co-design actually moves into the co-production that Megan was talking about earlier. Thank you for that. Anna, is there anything you want to pick up that builds on what Victor's saying, or, you know, other thoughts around, you know, the how, you know, how can government agencies and others do this better?
Thanks, Christina, because what comes to mind hearing Victor talk there is some learning we've had here in Australia. Again, this is all learning, right? We're all trying to co-create a shared future together. So some real, again, signs of promise have been around where government is showing up with community with a real intention to partner in order to accelerate and fund, come behind the community-led agenda for change. Now, what we are seeing is even the way that partnership comes together is so critical, that point of connection. So I'd love to share a story around that. And we're seeing, you know, the lessons from this story ripple across much of the practice in Australia. A lot more work to be done, but there's one of our government initiatives from Commonwealth Government. The intention is to partner with a number of communities to really demonstrate and learn from how collective impact, particularly, can be amplified and how effective it is. And to get to that point, the government has come to a number of the communities with a partnership exploration process. Now, often imperfect, right? But where it's worked really well is where there's been genuinely the time and space created to sit in that partnership exploration. What that's looked like is government showing up with humility, but also owning what its agenda is and what its mandate is. Coming in with a process that's looked like a number of dialogue sessions, conversations, workshops with community, like citizens, other stakeholders in the community, other funders, government, truly listening to what the stories have been, the narrative of change that has preceded this point in time, and looking at, you know, what does it mean to partner now? What's been called for? Sometimes that deep listening has taken 6, 12 plus months. And that process in itself has actually helped build readiness of the government partners, of community and others into that partnership process. Some of the things that we've looked out for in that readiness building process, partnership exploration, has been, is there enough? So it doesn't need to be perfect. Is there enough shared purpose? Is there enough awareness of the power that each of the stakeholder groups hold and how they may use that and harness that behind the community agenda? Is there enough trust? And this is knowing that from generations and generations, trust has been broken and stretched. But is there enough trust to take the next steps forward around true collaboration? Now, where that's been done well, it's set up the basis for an ongoing learning relationship and partnership with government, seeing that the work is not just done by and loaded by community, but done by all parts of the system, particularly government too. Where it's not done well, where that time hasn't been honoured, that space hasn't been created because of other agendas, it's damaging. And we know that. It damages and it fractures communities and it slows down the change that was already there. So it's a precious window in time. And I think where we've seen that process of partnership exploration, understanding the readiness building it takes across all parts of the system, when that's really authorised and understood and resourced, seeing that that's practice and the practice that's required for that, that's I think it's a really promising sign for what's possible.
Thanks, Anna. That's really encouraging, and I love that concept of partnership exploration. You know, not actually taking the time to explore whether and how partnership is possible, and building the conditions for that or the readiness for that as part of that process, I think is fascinating, and also that recognition that not doing it well can actually be damaging. So that's another good thing to hold on to. So I'm going to go to our first question now, actually. So Megan, this one is for you, and I think going back to the diagram. So have you got any thoughts on how to weave people into the fabric deeper if they're only linked in? You know, for example, does it take more than one touch point to be really integrated, and what does that look like on the ground?
I think the first word that jumps out to me is relationship, and the second one is trust. And actually those two are interrelated in terms of we don't always need everyone doing everything together, but actually having a deep enough relationship and knowing when to bring people in and out, and what's the information flows that need to kind of go in and about and around is really important. And that requires some intentionality and some kind of consciousness building. So I think it's, you know, no one has all the relationships, and no one wants to be in all the meetings, but actually what does that kind of system mapping and network mapping and connections look like? Because I think, yeah, if we can bring those webs of connections we have with a better good together, and we started to see a little bit of that through COVID. Sorry, I'm just going to take a mouthful of water. We actually, hapū and iwi, for example, had relationships with people in rural communities, for example, that some of the agencies did. So we don't need to duplicate that. We just need to tap in and kind of extend it and grow those networks, and not to clone and not to colonize, but actually to just to respectfully do that weaving in a way that adds value, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Megan. Thank you. We have another question now, and I'm going to start with you, Victor, but each of the panelists may have a view on this as well. So someone wants to hear more about safe spaces, how we create these when we are trying to address power dynamics. So any thoughts on that, how government agencies can create greater safety in that discussion or addressing of power dynamics?
In terms of the of keeping the place safe, it would seem that there is value, significant value actually, in understanding, and I think Anna touched on it ever so briefly, around understanding what the kaupapa is. And once we understand that, and that our intent towards around that kaupapa is honourable, in terms that we will be respectful, and we would acknowledge that that all of us have mana, or authority, for want of a better word, in that environment, and it's the respect and the appreciation that we've all come together to seek that pathway of enlightenment that's going to realize that the aspiration that is going to have a powerful collective benefit for all of us. And so it's not one voice dominating the other, but we've all come as equals. And there's an expression in the Tairāwhiti, which is he tangata rite, that we sit at the table and that we all have, we all bring the mana of our pepeha, of our organisation to the table. And that creates, and it's that understanding that creates that safe place where dialogue can happen. So that, and I really appreciated the comment that was made about it's unhelpful when you enter into that space with preconceived notions on how things are going to work. That is, and that spot, that sort of, you can almost smell that rat in the room almost instantly, and that creates a whole lot of mistrust and confusion, and it doesn't bode well for the kaupapa being discussed in a really free and frank way, and for an outcome to be positive in the sense that everyone is able to contribute to it in a meaningful way.
Thanks, Victor. That's a really thoughtful answer. I definitely that being able to come in with a much more a less structured expectation is one of those very important factors. Megan, Anna, anything else you want to add to that?
I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, look, we talk a lot about creating safe spaces and brave spaces too, right? Because safety is critical, but we're also trying to challenge the status quo. And, you know, all of us who know what that work feels like, that's tough work at a personal level. It's tough work at a family level, at an institutional level. It's the work of nation recreating, right? So I think there's something there in safe and brave enough to be able to lean into the heat that creates, and know that we are having just enough heat for that change to be happening, but not overcook it where we refracture, we lose part of people at the table. So, I mean, that really looks practical at times around having enough trust to have some of the tough conversations, name power dynamics in the room. We've over the years developed a practice called deep collaboration, which is a practice of naming the power dynamics and the roles that start to show up, particularly when we are collaborating between First Nations Australians and other multicultural Australians. And we find that by naming and surfacing those power dynamics, naming their roles, just by being conscious of it even, is a stepping stone for them actively working on that in the room. But I think overall, and this is something I've learned from my my Aboriginal friends and colleagues, is there's something about recognising that we're custodians of this next story, and we are doing this work on behalf of our families, with our institutions, and, as I said, for our country, for our shared future. So when I think about safe and brave spaces, I think about what that means for me as a Powell, as a CEO of a not-for-profit organisation, and how I'm perceived with those different spaces that I show up in. Megan, what resonates for you?
Yeah, just supporting all of that, and I'm just thinking about the principles that you develop when you have those conversations, and if you do that work early enough and call a spade, I'm always really up for that. But sometimes you have some of those call a spade moments in the big room, and sometimes there's stuff that happens outside in the car parks and other spaces, and that's where I think that notion of allyship becomes really, really important. How can we have the power that we have to call bad behaviour that we see others making, etc., in respectful ways to actually help take things forward? Because sometimes things are done in ignorance rather than arrogance. And actually, we've got a role in supporting others to just make some things, put it into plain sight about what we're seeing so that things can move forward.
Yeah. Thanks, Megan. And just the other thing that I'm reflecting on is that moving into these deeper relationships and more challenging conversations, actually the value of really skilled facilitation in those conversations, which is one of the things that Inspiring Communities has been developing for a really long time. So just realizing that that might be required or be useful right from the beginning to help hold those containers and allow those conversations to occur. Great, thank you. Well, we do have another question, and I'm going to go back to you, Megan, with this one. It is directed at you. So someone was really interested in your remark about planning versus doing, and it is a delicate balance. You know, trust and shared ways of working between stakeholders is critical, but often requires that time to develop, and rushing into doing can lead to friction without the foundation of trust. So this person is just wondering if you have any comments or stories about finding a good balance between planning, building trust, and getting on with the doing.
Well, those things are totally all integrated and need to be seen as that continuum. And for me, it's that notion of adaptive planning. And actually, we might be doing our bigger visioning, and we might be doing our work to work out what we need to do for the future. But if there's some things that are ready to go now, how can we do some small things along the way? So we've got that big and small working at the same time to build trust and confidence, because we talk about collaboration, but my experience over the last couple of decades is that it is best learned by doing some small things together. So not starting on the big, but starting on the small. So I see a whole lot of things can happen kind of concurrently, but making sure we've got effort and resource left after we've done our planning to do some stuff too. Because I think we've seen a few national strategies done in New Zealand actually, and then there's no money or regional strategies even, but then there's no money for actually doing stuff. So being really mindful about the expectations that can be set up by deep strategies if there's actually not money and next steps processes set up to do those. Because again, that destabilizes trust. Often a lot of great work happens in engagement processes to build strategies, but then if we don't do something with it, again, that's not going to take those relationships the next step further. So for me, it's that notion of planning and doing being iterative cycles, and actually our strategy or our plan is our kind of framework for getting started, and we should be keeping that live as we're going along, because we don't know what's coming, we don't know what's working, and we need to have flexibility to adapt in real-time kind of ways, rather than go back to that tomb 2 years ago that said that's what we were going to do, but actually it's not fit for purpose anymore. So
great, thank you, Megan. I really like that idea of what are the small things that we can do, and maybe all agree that it's going to be a learning process along the way, and then iterate. Victor, have you got any insights that might be valuable on that point as well? Or examples, perhaps?
Just reflecting on a hui recently around a kaupapa that was brought to a table, and there had been considerable documentation, planning around the presentation of this particular kaupapa, which actually would affect the whole of the Tairāwhiti, Tūrangi-Aotearoa area. But essentially there was it came down to the communications on what the expectation of around the response from the hui. And so after I was asked to do the karakia, and a mihi took place, but the mihi was the master of the person leading the hui decided that the organisation who owned the kaupapa would be part of the mihi, and the rest of the community were left out. That wasn't good planning on their part in terms of keeping that whole environment safe for everybody. And so halfway through, when members of the iwi community were being missed out, there was a point of order called, and it created quite an awkward pause in the deliberations, which continued after everyone was included. The second thing that happened was that it became very obvious that as part of the planning, it would seem that a decision had already been made around what was going to transpire in this particular kaupapa, at which point another point of order was called, and the question was asked, is this a fait accompli? I guess the point I'm making is that in terms of all planning around kaupapa and keeping that place safe for all of those who are interacting and engaging, that we've got to be pretty upfront, straight up about what's happening and what all our contribution is, so that we get to the end and we have an outcome which is based on a shared understanding of what has transpired.
Great, thanks, Victor. We did have another question, but I realise we've only got 3 minutes to go, so I think we might have to close that kōrero there, and thank you. We really appreciate all of your questions, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them today. We are going to put up a quick poll now. It's an anonymous poll, and it's really just some feedback from you that would help us give us a guide on how relevant and helpful this webinar has been for you, and that helps us plan the content of the future webinars. And in the meantime, I'll just ask our panelists to gather their thoughts and share a few final words with us. So what's your one key takeaway for our audience from the conversations that we've had today? Let's start with you, Megan, and then Anna, and then Victor.
For me, just reflecting on commonalities, what's happening internationally, some of the stuff Anna's talking about is incredibly relevant in how we keep sharing learnings. And again, with iwi Māori communities, you know, what's working well, what's not, and having those honest conversations, you know, words like, you know, being conscious and intentional, and, you know, what does it actually mean to deepen relationships and help us all not have to reinvent the wheels? Because if we see this work as being evolutionary rather than sorted, it kind of takes the pressure off us to have it right for the first time. But yeah, keeping curious, keeping inquisitive, and being prepared to challenge and evolve together, for me, stands out.
Kia ora, thanks, Megan. Anna?
Really similar, and I think that says a lot to what Megan shared. I take from this, because I feel like we could keep the conversation going for another few hours, as a signal of, you know, weaving it all parts of the system, and that includes, you know, across the work that we're doing internationally as well. There's a lot here in Australia we are already learning and can learn more from what's happening over the ditch. But, you know, how do we actually be in more genuine learning exchanges together? Because this is work that does require learning into, again, as Megan said, not replicating or duplicating what's been happening. So I look forward to more of this, actually. And knowing that this takes resourcing. The work that for inspiring communities to put this together, the relationships it takes, you know, I think just another shout out, pay what it takes for this change to happen. Yeah.
Great message, Anna, thank you. And Victor, your final few words or thoughts?
The Māori heart is a resilient heart. Te manawa Māori is a resilient heart, and it has had to be because of the challenge that has been along through the generations, that the manawa Māori has been exposed to but has overcome. And some of the comments that have been coming in indicate there is some really great stuff happening in Māori communities throughout Aotearoa, and that really needs to be celebrated, and that's really through hard work. However, the Māori heart also beats at varying degrees in other communities around Aotearoa, and I guess this webinar is a signpost for helping share some ideas to ensure that today and tomorrow, all of our heart as a country will be in a much more a better place.
Thanks, Victor, for that wonderful reminder to close out the Kōrero today. It has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you all for your contributions to that, and for the questions and participation as well from you out there and in our audience. And for more on this topic, we have put together a few links for you to other resources that you might want to follow up on. So we will send those out to you as part of this slide pack after this webinar. And I'm sure that most of you will have heard about Paradigm by now. It's the consultancy arm of Inspiring Communities. We specialise in community-led innovation and transformation, and been doing a great range of projects over the last year, canvassing really diverse issues with different organisations. So we've got a team of associates with a wealth of experience who can support you with planning for authentic collaboration, policy development, co-design, co-production, developmental evaluation, transformation, all of those great things that we've been talking about today. So do get in touch if you think we might be able to support your mahi. So there is a lot more happening at Inspiring Communities. Won't go over these events, but they will also be in your slide pack. If you're interested in any of those, please do hop on, do link in and register for those. Yeah, so I think we will just close again with Victor leading us in a karakia. Kia ora, Victor.
Tifa te pō, tifa te ao. Nā rangi tū koe, nā rangi roa, nā tāne rawa koe. Nā te apārangi hihi, nā te apārangi I rara. Tuku ai whare rangi te ngahuru mai rangi ki he mauri ora tīna haumi e hui e tai e. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora. Go well, everyone, and we'll see you next time. Mā te wā.